You've probably heard people talk about being a dog person or a cat person, right? But what if that's way more than just a simple preference? What if it's actually a key to understanding the confusing world we're all trying to navigate? In this explainer, we're diving into a really fascinating framework that says we're all running on this kind of unseen programming. I mean, let's be honest. If you've ever looked around and felt like the world is just off, like chaos is the new normal, you are definitely not alone. And that exact feeling, that's our starting point today. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The core argument here is that this chaos, it isn't an accident. It's described as a booming, buzzing confusion. And the whole point of this state of overwhelm is that it makes us more open to influence. It kind of breaks down our ability to just think clearly for ourselves. So if this chaotic feeling isn't just random static, what's really going on underneath it all? The source material for this has a pretty profound diagnosis. It argues the real problem is something called the metaphysical vacuum. Okay, so what does that mean? The idea is that as a society, we've lost our shared foundation. You know, those big stories, the common beliefs that used to give us a sense of stability and meaning, well, they've been worn down, and that's left a huge void, a metaphysical vacuum. And as we all know, nature absolutely hates a vacuum. Something always rushes in to fill it. To figure out what exactly is filling that void, the author turns to the incredible work of psychologist Carl Jung. Jung had this theory that we all share what he called a collective unconscious. Think of it like a kind of inherited psychic software. And that software comes with its own dark side, the collective shadow, and these universal patterns he called archetypes. And it's these deep patterns that we really need to understand. And that brings us right to the main tool we're going to use to decode our world, those universal patterns that Jung called archetypes. Just think of them as our hidden programming. So an archetype isn't some rule you have to follow. It's more like a pre-installed template in your mind. It's the basic pattern that shapes how you see the world and makes sense of everything. And most of the time, you don't even know it's there. So how does this actually work? Well, for one, these patterns are ancient. They exist in us before we learn a single thing from our culture. They're basically instincts for making sense of the world. Culture then comes along and pours all the specific stories and characters into these ancient molds. But, and this is key, it doesn't create the molds themselves. Okay, so if we're all running on this kind of ancient software, how can we use that idea to diagnose the intense, competing belief systems that seem to be clashing all around us? How do we actually map the chaos? And this brings us to the big reveal. The source gives us a central metaphor to map everything, and it's this brilliantly simple yet really powerful diagnostic tool: dogs versus cats. All right, let's break this down. The author suggests there are two fundamental postures. First, you have the dog archetype. This one values loyalty above everything else. It's what's called covenantal, which means it's bound by a deep, unbreakable promise, and it will defend its master, even at great personal cost. Then, on the other hand, you've got the cat archetype. This one values independence. It's clever, it's adaptable, and it resists authority. It's non-covenantal. Its loyalty is a bit more conditional. This quote just perfectly captures the whole idea, doesn't it? When the flock is actually in danger, you don't want a clever, independent observer. You need a committed, loyal defender. Now, it is absolutely crucial to get this point straight. This is not a moral judgment. It's not about saying one is good and the other is bad. This is a tool, a way of analyzing the underlying moral logic of a belief system, especially seeing how it acts when it's under pressure. So let's see how this framework actually gets applied to a real-world example from the source material. This is where the rubber really meets the road. So the source takes a close look at a speech by politician Tulsi Gabbard. In it, she uses some really powerful covenantal language. She talks about God-given rights, she quotes Christian scripture. That is pure dog archetype language. But the analysis points out that since she herself is Hindu, she isn't technically part of the specific covenant that she's invoking. The author describes this as an unstable borrowing of moral capital. And this whole example leads to a really critical question that's at the heart of the source's argument. Does that phrase, God-given rights, carry the same weight, the same authority, if the God you're talking about isn't the specific one that tradition came from? The argument here is that a right that comes from a very specific, binding, covenantal tradition is fundamentally different from a right that's based on a more generic, kind of interchangeable idea of a higher power. One is like a rock-solid inheritance. The other, the source suggests, is more like a loan that can be called in at any time. So, where does all this leave us? What's the ultimate takeaway? Well, the conclusion of this whole framework is a pretty stark warning about what happens when the wolves arrive. The source wraps it all up with this incredibly powerful statement. The cat archetype, independent, adoptable, non-committal, it thrives when society is safe and stable. But the dog archetype, loyal, willing to sacrifice, bound by duty, that becomes absolutely essential when things start to fall apart. And that leaves us with the final, really provocative question. As the world feels more and more chaotic, and the proverbial wolves seem to be at the door, which posture, which of these hidden programs, does a civilization actually need to survive? That's definitely something to think about.